You all okay with this being recorded?
Do we have a choice?
That wasn't in my contract, but
No problem. But you have to ask.
Well, like,
We don't mind if you record it, just don't ever play it.
there we go.
I second Ambassador Becker's suggestion.
as long as nobody plans to watch.
Yeah. That way I can acknowledge you. All right, good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. And as we do so, I want to thank our tech team back there, Susanna and associate, and Chris Egan, our associate dean here in the Fulton School, and John Murphy for pulling together the technological side of this. I guess I should thank Owly here too, which looks like Alexa with eyes. Apparently it's a technological marvel, so it's going to help keep everything sort of in focus, and our audience out there especially able to hear us tonight. So thank you for joining us. My name is Martin Parabaum. I'm dean of the Fulton School of Liberal Arts here at Salisbury University and a professor of history. I teach the Second World War, the Cold War, the Holocaust. I'm teaching the Holocaust this semester, definitely relating what's happening right now to those events during the Second World War. So I'm going to read a brief introduction. I figure if I read, then I won't digress, and that way I'll keep on task. I told my esteemed colleagues here, whom I will introduce, and I'll thank them in general right now for putting their remarks together. But I limited them to 5 to 7 minutes, and so get your stopwatches out. But just in the interest of moving through the initial presentation and giving us a lot of time to interact and hopefully give them the opportunity to really dig in and go into some greater depth in their areas of expertise. So I'm going to start with this. On February 24th, i.e. 12 days ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, violating the sovereignty of its neighbor, an independent nation. While history provides many examples of violent attacks such as this, nation states in today's world can pay a heavy price for this kind of aggression, though only if other nation states hold them accountable. Since the Second World War, the world's wealthiest nations have supported an international order that, however imperfectly, champions the global exchange of goods and services as in the best interest of all its members. Peaceful conditions need to prevail for that exchange to happen. While many of the leading nations in the global economy are democratic, with constitutions aimed at protecting freedoms and human rights, in recent decades, several countries better described as autocracies have become major players in the world economy, most notably China, less notably Russia. With the population of about 44 million, Ukraine lies to Russia's south and west. In area, it's about the size of France, so one of the larger countries in Europe, except for, of course, the European portion of Russia itself. Before the First World War, it was part of the Russian Empire. After the 1917 Revolution and Civil War, Ukraine became one of the 15 republics that made up the Soviet Union. That Soviet Union broke up, of course, in 1991 at the end of the Cold War, becoming 15 different independent states. And at that time, Ukraine had a large arsenal of nuclear weapons, but in an international agreement that included both the United States and Russia, gave them up in return for a guarantee of its borders. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which I can guarantee Ambassador Becker is going to talk about.
I have to.
So that's important. That's at least 2 of our panelists who are signed on to dig into that. While multiple former Soviet republics adopted democratic constitutions, many, including Russia, devolved into autocracy with authoritarian and corrupt governments, keeping people in check while a limited number of individuals, oligarchs, amassed enormous fortunes for themselves. Vladimir Putin's personal power and wealth set him apart as the lead beneficiary of this system. Until 2014, the story was similar in Ukraine: oligarchy and corruption. Its Maidan revolution in 2014 set the country on a path toward greater democracy, marked by strong sentiment in favor of joining the European Union, which only admits democratic states, although some of its member states have backslid in recent years toward autocracy. Multiple former Soviet satellites and republics have joined the EU since the end of the Cold War, and I know a number of our panelists are going to talk about the difference between the former satellites and the republics as they relate to these organizations in their remarks. But the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, obviously a very important concept here, or NATO, has expanded during that time. Since the end of the Cold War, originally signed in 1949 to, as it was quipped at the time, keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down, with reference to Western Europe. It's a defensive military alliance, and which holds that an attack on any single member of the NATO alliance is an attack on all of them. And of course, that means that the United States would come to its defense, and we'd basically have a world war on our hands. 3 former Soviet republics actually belong to NATO, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. But so far, Russian attacks on Georgia and Ukraine, which are not members, have underscored the reality that NATO's primary purpose is to deter aggression against its members and prevent World War III. None of this, however, helps us truly understand why Putin launched an invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. That's why we're here tonight. If we can dig into that, maybe we still won't be able to answer it. But as we saw in Belarus last year, Putin does not hesitate to interfere with democratic processes that threaten the power of his vassals. ... I'll just leave that there. However, he could not stop the overwhelming victory of Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine in 2019. But even if Putin hates to see Ukraine gravitating toward the West, greater democracy, and heaven forbid NATO, war is an extraordinary, costly, and criminal step to take. Even if Russia ends up prevailing militarily, how does it actually win? Meanwhile, there are lots of ways to lose. Until 2 weeks ago, most of the world seemed okay exchanging goods and services with Russia. While the world's wealthy nations are understandably reluctant to engage directly in warfare, they can ostracize Russia economically and are in the process of doing so. So to the degree that this has become a confrontation between autocracy and democracy, Putin has made it that. I'm going to stop there and now turn to our panelists. Do you want to speak from your seats?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, so I think. Yeah, we can, yeah, that's good. That way we can just look at the panelists. So we're going to start with Dr. Greg Ferentz, colleague from the Department of History, who's going to talk about, with a focus on events from 1989, i.e. the fall of the Berlin Wall, to approximately 2014, that have influenced the actions of Vladimir Putin.
Well, first of all, I need to correct my esteemed colleague, Martin Pereboom, and that is Western Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Ukraine wasn't always totally under Russian control. So anyhow.
And Lviv was.
Or Lviv, Lvov,
Yeah.
Lemberg, whatever you want to call it. So, right. So anyhow, what I'm going to talk about is approximately the last, say, 3 decades, over 3 decades, and some major events that have influenced what Putin views the proper, say, stance of Russia to be in relationship to Ukraine. Some of these points were already talked about by Dr. Pereboom. I mean, this is a tragedy. We all agree all along that. But to Putin, it's not a tragedy. It's just a mere military incursion. Well, anyhow, we go back all the way to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Putin at that time was a colonel in the KGB in Dresden, and it has a dramatic effect on him. Keep in mind, I have 5 minutes, so I can't really go into much detail. Okay, so that's one thing, fall of the Berlin Wall. Secondly, we have the German reunification in 1990. That too plays into what we have seen recently, and again, I don't have time to do so. Perhaps even more important was in 1990 or 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union into the various republics, which Martin mentioned, the 15 republics overall. Putin wants to maintain a Russian sphere of influence in those 15 states. However, as Martin mentioned earlier, places like the Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia have, shall we say, escaped that Russian grip. However, other republics, he believes that Russia should have a major say in that. For example, you mentioned Belarus last summer. Recently, in the fall, we had, of course, Russian paratroopers going in to prop up the government in Kazakhstan. So, I mean, it just kind of shows that these old republics are still part of the Russian sphere of influence. And I don't say he wants to recreate the Soviet Union, because I don't believe that is the case. As Martin mentioned, and I think Mr. Becker will talk about, and that is the Budapest Memorandum from 1994, which denuclearized not only Ukraine, but Belarus and Kazakhstan. So, I mean, are you going to attack another country that has nuclear weapons? I don't even think twice. Then, after Putin became prime minister of Russia in 1999, and then later when Yeltsin resigned, becomes president of Russia, we have what's known as the Second Chechen War. what we see today occurring in Ukraine, we had it all back then. I mean, you know, indiscriminate bombing, assassinations, attacking civilians, convoys, you name it, okay? So we have, you know, a record here. Well, next we have, in 2003, we have what's known as the Rose Revolution in Georgia, which got rid of the old Russian well, should I say, Soviet leadership in that country. And the country slowly moved towards the West. When they talked about joining NATO in 2008, that's when the Russians invaded, using all sorts of pretexts, like what we see today in the Donbass region, that they use separate republics and things like that, okay? So anyhow, that is another example. Martin also mentioned about the Marathon, or the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, 2013 to 2014. And that basically chased out pro-Russian government officials. The president of Ukraine was rescued by Russian special forces and taken to Russia. And of course, in connection with that, then you had shortly thereafter the annexation of Crimea. And this goes back to, say, Khrushchev's day, when Crimea was given to Ukraine as kind of a present for some 1600s treaty. Of course, then shortly thereafter the annexation, you're going to have the war breaking out in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass region. Keep in mind, these two things are related, because the price of oil at this time was $109 a barrel. See similarities between then and now. So the Russian coffers were just flush with money. So oil was fueling that. After that, oil dropped down around $30 a barrel. Russia was kind of quiet until recently. So Western sanctions as a result of Crimea and the Donbass region amounted to very little. And so that kind of allowed Putin to think, you know, these are paper tigers, so to speak. And the last thing I want to mention is one thing that people don't really discuss, and that is in 2018 and 2019, is you have the establishment of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. Beforehand, it was part of the Russian Orthodox Church. So it separates it. And so the Russian Orthodox Church and the government go hand in hand. So it means Putin has lost a lot of influence in Ukraine, and he can't allow this to continue. So some events.
Thank you. All right, we're going to turn now to Ambassador Becker, who's an adjunct faculty member in the Political Science, International Relations, and Conflict Analysis and Dispute Resolution programs here at Salisbury. I want to point out that he holds the title of ambassador in part because he was deputy head of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's mission to both Croatia and Ukraine. So he's been there, literally. And so we turn now to Ambassador Becker.
Yeah, Martin asked me if I would talk a bit about the impact of this war. I think Greg has laid out the background extremely well, hitting all the high points. And yes, the Budapest Memorandum is certainly one of the high points, or low points, depending on how you look at it. But first of all, for this evening, I wanted to digress just a second to say to all of you women present, those particularly working on the panel and setting things up, highest regards and very best wishes on International Women's Day. This is a very important holiday, and I think we also should say best regards and highest esteem to all the women of Ukraine, both those who are staying behind and fighting, and those who are taking the children and the older people out as refugees to the West. And I would add to this, from my personal experience, all of the women in the chain, and it's all been women that I've worked with, meeting the refugees, taking the refugees across the border, feeding them, caring for them, and getting them settled into some sort of warm and safe housing. So on this International Women's Day, thank you all, ladies. Thank you all for what you do for us. I lived and worked in Kiev, as Dean Parabum said, for 2 years. And I also served as an election monitor during that period and was privileged to be a monitor when President Zelensky was elected. And I must say that was one of the cleanest elections in the 4 that I observed in Ukraine possible. Impact of Putin's massive aggression in the West. his really totally unprovoked attack against Ukraine, not only in the Donbass, but across the entire country, and his effort to take over Ukraine has really brought Europe up short. It's a kind of a Pearl Harbor moment. They are shocked by this event. And it's particularly interesting how it's hit the left-leaning parties and the anti-militarist sentiment in Europe, but also right-wing parties who had been drawing support from President Putin. Putin, when he made this attack, really seems to have made a terrible miscalculation. Apparently, he expected the Western response to be somewhat like it had been when he intervened and attacked and took over parts of Georgia, when he got involved in Syria, when he took over the Crimea, when he went into the Donbass. Each time the West protested, but did nothing. And I believe he thought this would just be another case and he would be able to roll over the Ukrainians who would roll up and he could then put a puppet government in place and have a more compliant state to work with him. But as President Biden stated so forcefully in his State of the Union address, Putin ran into a stone wall, the Ukrainian people. And they have been determined to fight for their independence and their sovereignty. Living in Ukraine, I tried to learn Ukrainian, not a very easy language, even though I do know a little bit of Russian. And I can tell you, it's a very different language than Russian. It's as different as Romanian and Portuguese. I don't know how much Portuguese you understand, but you know, it is quite a bit of difference. And even the Russian-speaking people, native speakers, mother tongue Russian speakers in Ukraine, are Ukrainians. They don't want to be, for the most part of Russia. But what happened? The unexpected resistance of the Ukrainian people, the unexpected solidarity of NATO and the EU has really come as a surprise for Mr. Putin. I can recommend two articles to you. It appeared in the Washington Post this last week, one by Carl Bildt, the former foreign minister of Sweden and a leading European scholar and professor, politician, and by Mark Fisher of the Washington Post, both of which come to the conclusion that the change that has been brought about by this attack is going to be as far-reaching as even the fall of the wall or even more. It is going to transform the nature of European geopolitics because all of Western Europe is now firmly lined up in opposition to the threat posed by Mr. Putin. NATO, as we have seen, has come together as never before in its history. It has strengthened the eastern flank by sending troops into Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, right up to the border. The number of countries supplying weapons to Ukraine has gone from 5 to 14, including Sweden and Finland, two classic neutrals. And even the Swiss have gotten into the action, laying down sanctions. Switzerland, a country which is known for staying neutral and taking care of its banking systems. The worldwide condemnation has come quite surprisingly that the reaction is just as strong in Japan as it is in Spain. When there was a vote in the United Nations about condemning Russian aggression, only 5 countries supported Russia: Syria, North Korea, Eritrea, Belarus, of course, and the Russians, of course, voted in their own favor. Even China, Hungary, and Serbia, countries which are friendly towards or have had good relations with Russia, either abstained or didn't support him. Impact of the sanctions, I think we'll hear more about that from my colleagues, but in the first day, the ruble fell 30%, affecting everybody. Access to international, to banking has been cut off. American Express, the Visa, they've all closed down. MasterCard. they're no longer accessible to get international funds if you're a normal Russian. In fact, it may be even difficult for your cards to work in Russia. The stock market fell 40%. Sanctions have effectively limited access. Putin had put away $600 billion as a rainy day hard currency fund in foreign assets and gold bullion. That's been essentially frozen. He no longer has access to that. So we see NATO solidified as never before. The European Union, which has never been really as solid as it would like to be, and has never sent weapons into the conflict zone, is supplying weapons and is standing firmly against Russia. And if you look at individual countries, the UK is coordinating with the EU, even though it has just left it through Brexit. France, President Macron started out trying to do a little bit of independent diplomacy. He's now fully in line. I should stress Germany, because, and then we'll wrap it up. Germany did a 270-degree turnaround, not 180. They went around one time and more. 1 week before the invasion, the Germans were divided. They didn't know what they wanted to do. Chancellor Scholz shut down Nord Stream 2. The Green foreign minister admitted in front of the Bundestag, made a mistake. We have to send weapons. And whereas before they had sent 50,000 or 500 helmets, they are now sending Stingers, javelins, and offensive weapons, and a $6 billion euro aid package. And I can say from my personal experience, they're receiving and caring for thousands upon thousands of refugees and providing support, 11,000 a day going through Berlin, 100 a minute crossing into Poland. So I'll stop there and leave it open and we'll come back to it.
Start thinking about those questions. And thank you for noting International Women's Day. I was thinking about Svetlana Alexievich, who's an awesome writer from Sam knows. People read these books in my classes. The Unwomanly Face of War, about women, an oral history of women in the Second World War fighting for the Soviet Union. And she's from Belarus. So I wonder what she's thinking tonight about women fighting for Ukraine. So thanks for that, Ambassador Becker. We turn now to Dr. Joshua Bolton, who's Assistant Professor of Communication, to look at journalism and social media, in particular how the Biden administration has communicated with the American public about the crisis. I think very notably prior, right, we're all reading daily in the newspaper about that this was happening, that these troops, like we're thinking, holy cow, can this really be happening? And it was. So take it away, Dr. Bolton.
Yeah, as Dean Pernboom just kind of mentioned as he introduced me, what I'm going to talk about kind of is how Americans are making sense of this crisis. Because we're thousands of miles away, so we're not as close in proximity as members of the European Union are. And so we're sitting here watching this. And I'll start with President Biden giving his State of the Union address, which was very well-timed, I guess, in terms of when this crisis occurred, because the State of the Union is one of the most heavily watched presidential addresses when they occur. So if this had just been a interrupt your normal programming to give a special address, it wouldn't have had nearly the number of eyes on it that the State of the Union did. And so President Biden was able to really take this moment to both provide a reason for international unity and also provide almost a sympathetic eye toward the Ukrainian, especially when he pointed out the Ukrainian ambassador who looked very moved and touched by the acknowledgement that she was given. And so that really helped kind of make the case in the early days of this crisis for American intervention, which we'll talk about as we kind of go forward here. But it's basically the first step towards building solidarity among American publics. And so while this isn't a US specific event, I think it's significant politically, where we had the UN Security Council meeting, and when the Russian speaker started talking, the room cleared. That is a significant political act that was seen and heard around the world, where the Russian speaker to the UN was on Zoom essentially, speaking to an empty room because everybody had left. As we kind of move forward through these past 12 days, Secretary of State Blinken visited Eastern Europe a lot. He announced that NATO was authorized to send fighter jets to the Ukraine, and also talked about building international coalitions. As we've kind of learned over the last 20, 30 years, the American public doesn't like the US acting unilaterally. So building these international coalitions is kind of an important step toward making it so it appears that the United States isn't acting alone. And so that's an important thing that was a step that was taken. At White House press briefings, Deputy National Security Advisor Dalip Singh has been kind of branded as the sanctions guru. So he's been talking about how sanctions have been levied against Russia, what that means for Russia, even down to the economic detail of this is going to hurt their ability to buy and trade this at this level. So he's been there a lot over the last 12 days, kind of giving an update in a way that the White House press secretary just didn't feel qualified to give, because obviously as White House press secretary, you have to know a lot about everything. And so she brought in Deputy NSA in order to do that. Then finally, with this part, I'll talk about Biden's address today, where he announced that we will no longer be purchasing Russian-created energy sources. This speech obviously was meant to demonstrate that those sanctions are going in place, but it also read like a campaign speech given the 2022 midterms coming up in November. He first pushed to blame Putin's actions for our gas prices. This is Vladimir Putin's fault, not President Biden, because obviously if you follow social media, which I'll get to in a minute, a lot of conservatives are saying Joe Biden's the reason your gas is $4.15 a gallon. But he also pointed to that there's a real lack of significant impact on US oil supplies based on us saying no to Russian oil. He also indicated that US corporations were voluntarily pulling themselves out of Russia. There was no government edict saying McDonald's stop serving Big Macs in Russia. McDonald's chose to do that to show this is an international effort. And then he also pointed out that this is supported bipartisanly, which if you follow American politics, you know anything bipartisan these days is a rare occurrence. To really underscore that even if you're going to complain that these sanctions are leading to higher gas, it's not just a Democrat problem, because it's a bipartisan effort. But then he finally closed by mentioning something the ambassador also talked about, with the ruble being basically the equivalent, 1 ruble is the equivalent of a US penny. He mentioned that to say, yes, gas is going to go up and it's going to hurt us. However, it's hurting them way more by basically making their currency worth this bottle of water, empty. So I'll transition now talking about how social media has kind of covered this. Social media, as you know, allows for real-time coverage of international events. We can see coverage from reporters, so we can see what press are seeing in real time, but we can also see what individual citizens are seeing in real time. That opens up the floodgates. That's a net positive overall. However, that also means that it can be used for propaganda and putting out fake information. In the early days of the crisis and invasion, we saw videos from 5, 10 years ago being passed off as this is what's going on. And oftentimes if we're met with something that we see and it has an emotional charge to us, makes us feel something, we're less likely to vet that. And we're just very quick to share because it's made me feel something. And so that's a rough thing that we have to overcome in this. We need to be vetting these. Just a couple quick things. Russia has been banned from most social media platforms. However, it's easy to get around those with a VPN, which just basically you say, I'm in this country, not this country, and you can do that. Is it legal? No, but it's a way around it. And so the media has now added the social media they're seeing to their coverage. For instance, the other day we saw a little girl singing "Let It Go" at a refugee camp, and that's going to build that exact same emotional connection that we've kind of seen as we've talked about solidarity in this crisis. Because who's not going to feel a little something towards a small child singing "Let It Go"? So with that, I'll wrap up because I'm getting a signal that I'm out of time.
All right, thanks, Josh. We turn now to our colleague from the Purdue School of Business, with the first group tonight, Professor of Management and Marketing and former Director of Beacon, the Business, Economic and Community Outreach Network of Salisbury University until this past summer, Dr. Memo Diraker.
Thank you. And Ambassador Becker beat me to the punch. I was going to make allusion to the color of my shirt and ask you why you think I'm wearing this color. It's the International Women's Day color. So you just stole my punch there. Anyway, I look at this conflict as I have looked at many other conflicts in my career, small ones, big ones. And it all comes down to this, economically speaking. All conflicts create winners and losers beyond the battlefield. A lot of those winners and losers are individuals who have nothing to do with that conflict, such as our consumers here, such as our businesses here. There are three ways in which this conflict, like many other conflicts, will impact our consumers and our businesses directly. There's a question mark area, single question mark I'm going to allude to, and then there are three indirect ways this conflict is going to impact our consumers and businesses. Let's start with the direct one. The most obvious one is energy. Not only energy is the major export of Russia, but it is also the fundamental input to many of the processes that make our economies and our households work. Almost everything is dependent on energy, and every dollar we spend on energy, more than we have to spend, means that it's going to come from some other activity in which we're using those dollars. So that's going to impact not only us as consumers, but the businesses with whom we're not able to do business as usual because we're paying more for that energy. So that's a direct impact. In fact, you heard earlier that not too long ago, barrel of oil was $30. Today is well in excess of 100, I forgot what it was, 113 or something. But the prediction is that before this conflict resolves itself, we're going to see 150. I think maybe even more. But if we see 150, that automatically adds a percentage point to the annual inflation rate above, which already is quite high. So that one little thing adds 1 percentage point. It also slows down on the growth of our GDP, which means economic expansion, by 0.5 percentage point. You know what that means? If you continue doing that, you risk another recession right as we're coming out of the pandemic and growing our economy. So what does that do? It brings a second impact, stock market volatility. Since this conflict started, stock market lost over 10% of its market cap. This means companies that trade in the stock market have lost over $5 trillion of their value. Now, this is a double-edged sword because prior to this conflict, those stocks were overvalued by that amount. So in some ways, this is the external stimulus forcing the stock market to come back. However, historically speaking, stocks have reacted negatively to conflicts, but over the medium to long term, they have come back. Well, if this is a correction of the overvaluation, that means they're not going to come back. So people like me who are within a few years of retirement, we're looking at this and saying, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to my portfolio? Then, of course, another direct impact, although not as important as the first two, is the disruption of the supply channels. Today, Russians cannot travel. Planes cannot fly over their airspace. And a lot of the planes that go from the Western world to the Far East have to find new ways of traveling, spend more money on their fuel, charge more for the freight. Post-pandemic, more cargo is moving by air freight than ever before. So all that is going to have ripple effects on the supply chain, which is already sufficiently excessively disrupted. So these are the direct ones. Now there's an in-between one that I don't know whether it's going to happen or not, and that is what the Fed is going to do. Fed was on track to increase interest rates by between 2 and 4 points in the near future, because that's the way you pull inflation down. And we said this is probably going to put the inflation up. So you'd think there'd be in the market for pulling it more down and faster down. Problem is, it impacts the growth of the economy. It triggers possible another recession. So the Fed is now between a rock and a hard place. The only tool they have to pull down inflation is going to risk a recession. So we don't know what they're going to do. My crystal ball says they're going to take it slow just to see how it's going to play out. But at some point, they're going to have to make this difficult decision. Then there are a few indirect impacts on us as consumers and as businesses. Europe and UK combined is our largest trading bloc. Okay. If they are going to suffer in their economy, if they're going, because their energy impact is much higher, if they're going to shift resources, guess what? Those resources are not going to come to us. It's going to actually reduce our interactions with them. That means it's going to cost jobs, it's going to cost business, and we're going to see that ripple effect here, probably not immediately, but soon if this doesn't resolve. Then, especially in Europe, but here also, anytime we help, anytime we do sanctions, sanctions are effective, especially when so many countries come together to do them, but they're double-edged. When I'm saying American Express is not there, American Express is losing business volume. When I say I'm not going to exchange their money, I'm using financial revenues. So there is an impact here. That means our businesses, our financial institutions, even our business people are going to have to rearrange the way they deploy their resources. And that is going to have possibly significant negative repercussions later in this process. And especially in places like Europe, when they help with additional military assistance, refugees, etc., that's going to take money away from traditional government expenditures, traditional government transfer payments, your welfare, your healthcare, etc., to these realities. So there's going to be discontent at the level of households and businesses that have grown to rely on these subsidies, on these transfer payments. And finally, conflicts tend to lead to recessions. And it doesn't have to be here. It can be in Europe. It will be bad for us. So with that, I'll turn it to my colleague to talk about some of the refugee implications, etc.
All right, so I'll introduce Alexandra Ginta-Martin, who is an adjunct faculty member in our Department of Conflict Analysis and Dispute Resolution.
Thank you, Dr. Pereboom. I want to thank you personally and Dr. Egan for the invitation. For anyone that has put up with me for the last 12 days, I have not stopped talking about this conflict. So thank you for the grace and the patience and for a forum in which I can communicate my thoughts. This conflict is not like any other for me because it's personal and it's very close to home, quite literally. And you may say, what do you mean? You're sitting right here with us. Yes, but my heart is in Romania, where my family is, where my friends are. I was born and raised in Romania, and it's very hard to be here and talk about it in very theoretical terms when there's real life consequences and there's real danger happening over there for the people I know and love. So I generally tend to get very granular. I won't this time because of the time restrictions and also because my colleagues have shared such insightful perspectives. So I'll pepper in some details which I would like to bring into discussion. First one is the Russian sphere of influence in post Cold War Europe. Now, I'm sure we operate quite comfortably with these two concepts, right? Like former USSR states as well as satellite countries. But it's important to point out that the level of attention that that Russia has cast over these is different. So two satellite countries, for instance, were Romania and Bulgaria. And we've met some resistance from Russia when it came to our stated intentions to join NATO or the European Union, but not anything comparable to what the Ukraine or Georgia or the Republic of Moldova have faced. Now, Putin has called the collapse of the USSR a great catastrophe of the 20th century, and he has frequently warned the West to end what he called its geopolitical adventurism. Sure, we can talk about his expansionism, but that's for another time. But he has been very intentional about keeping Ukraine in its sphere of influence for a multitude of reasons, but one of them, and we can't separate ideology from Putin, he's always, and many have seen Ukraine as the birthplace of the Russian nation. So when Ukraine turned its face and attention to the West, of course, he perceived that as a great betrayal. And he's always secretly wanted to restore Russia to its historical glory. However, he understood that he would have to do that gradually. So he's done it in Georgia, Chechnya, Georgia, then Crimea, but Ukraine was kind of Putin's white whale. When Ukraine refused to join Russia's sphere of influence, I guess the logical thing for him to do was what he's currently doing, and without a doubt, he did not expect to meet the resistance he is currently facing. However, I think what Putin is failing to see is that Russia's sphere of influence is not appealing. One of the reasons why the Soviet Union fell was because of its bleak and weak and non-sustainable economic model. So I think, other than a show of force, which is what he's doing, he has very little to offer in terms of maintaining countries in the sphere of influence. And we now see Georgia, the Republic of Moldova, and of course, Ukraine symbolically requesting to join the European Union. So as far as the refugee crisis is concerned, I will add that it's the fastest growing crisis since the Second World War. An estimated 1.7 to 2 million refugees so far. Now, Europe has seen a somewhat big crisis in 2015 with the Syrian refugees. They had a different response to that crisis. So if we're being honest, we have to point that out. But truthfully, as Ambassador Becker said, there's been this newfound sense of European unity, of cohesion, everyone's doing their absolute best, except for Hungary, who closed their borders for about 3 hours. No one really quite understands why. But again, Hungary has never been a pioneer in terms of their generosity show towards refugees. The European Union is also trying to implement very specific ways in which they can assist refugees, which includes the right to stay and work throughout the 27 nations for up to 3 years. They would also receive social welfare and access to housing, medical treatment, and schooling for children. Another concern that I have, and I will probably never be able to ease this thought that I have, is Russia inching further into Europe. And I have a particular area in mind that I think is problematic at this time. I'm curious if Ambassador Becker agrees, and it's Transnistria. That is a very small break.
You better explain what Transnistria is.
Yes, I am. I'm prepared to do that. Very, very much prepared to do that. So the official name is the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic, which is a breakaway territory between the Republic of Moldova and Ukraine. Think of it as a Soviet capsule. It still has numerous Lenin statues imposing Soviet-style architecture, and the national flag is the last one in the world that still displays the hammer and the sickle. So they've been, they identify as Russian. They've tried to declare their autonomy from the Republic of Moldova, and there's been a long-standing conflict there. They're right at the border with Ukraine. So my fear at this time is that Russia might decide to recognize their independence, which is what they did prior to invading. They did that with Luhansk and Donetsk, the two regions, the Donbass region. So why is that problematic? Because it would create an enclave of Russian influence smack dab between Ukraine and Moldova, and that would just further complicate things for everything from access to Ukraine to humanitarian corridors, all of that. So that's definitely a marginal conflict to watch. And also I will note there are 1,000 Russian soldiers in Transnistria guarding 22,000 tons of ammunition housed in a depot in a village in Kobazna. The site is thought to be the largest ammunition depot in Eastern Europe. About half of them are unusable, but nonetheless a very problematic relic of the Cold War. Another threat that I think is on everyone's mind is the current nuclear threat, but not so much in the form of Russian missiles or bombs, but in the form of the nuclear plants that the Russians have been taking over in Ukraine. Ukraine has 15 operable nuclear reactors located in 4 power plants across the country, and 4 decommissioned at Chernobyl. 3 sites have been attacked by Russia so far. Now, everyone's asking why, and we can speculate a little bit. No one really confirmed it. As far as Chernobyl is concerned, the supposition is that they didn't want insurgents to get their hands on radioactive materials to make dirty bombs. But if we talk about the nuclear plant in Zaporizhia, which is the largest in Europe, that produces 1/4 of Ukraine's overall power production. So what does that mean? Lights on, lights off, controlled by Putin. So that's a big bargaining chip. That's huge leverage. And there's also the psychological factor of using like nuclear threat in speeches and discussion. We've seen him do that abundantly. So he's certainly going to use that fear tactic. And he also needed these details to back up his rhetoric that Ukraine was developing nuclear weapons, which they were not. They gave up their stockpile in 1994. As my colleagues mentioned, it was the 3rd largest in the world, and they did that rather effortlessly in exchange of promises for sovereign integrity and territory integrity, and where we are right now. And my concluding thoughts are NATO and the European Union potentially the saviors of Ukraine? And I'm happy to receive criticism, but I will say at this time, not more than in terms of what Ambassador Becker described. I think membership for Ukraine in both of these organizations is a bit of a distant dream at this time, because both of these organizations have really specific accession conditions and prerequisites. Ukraine wasn't there before the war, truthfully. And they're certainly not going to be there after the war. And I would highly doubt that either of the two would create a sort of specific pathway just for the accession of Ukraine. So I think those 35 chapters that have to be checked off before a country joins the European Union, all those requirements outlined by NATO in their 1995 agreement, all those would still have to happen, even if there's a significant wave of sympathy for Ukraine right now. So we can do what we can, but realistically, membership is still unlikely in the near future.
Thank you. Yeah, by the rules of the European Union, or what I guess the rules up to 2 weeks ago at least, it would have been awfully tough for a country as impoverished as Ukraine is in terms of GDP and per capita, because its GDP per capita is far lower than that of Bulgaria, which is right now the poorest member of the European Union, which means that Europeans would be facing basically subsidizing the Ukrainian economy to a very substantial degree, which they would have balked at doing again until 2 weeks ago. I think all bets are off now in terms of that particular consideration. But
they violated their own rules once before in letting a country in, and that was Greece. And I can
Yeah.
tell you from my service with the European Union, they kept asking me, why did we do that? They really believe in following the rules.
Right. Well, and Greece certainly has that. They paid a heavy price for that. We recall the crisis surrounding Greece a few years ago. Before we transition to questions from the audience, I want to see if panelists had any comments in response to what any of the other panelists may have said. Did you sort of right of first refusal to respond to what anyone here has said?
I would just like to point out in the last presentation that in the leading up to the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, there were two areas, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, where the Russians used that as kind of an excuse. And I could see that being used in Transnistria for them to come in as well. So sort of like, in the Donbass region and Ukraine. So, I mean, we have here a pattern of what Putin has done. So I think there is a good chance that could occur.
Absolutely, and that I was going to mention that, but again, my fear is I get too granular when I talk about this. I'm like, oh, how far do I go with my examples?
Right, sure.
But yes, absolutely, and those two have been as problematic as Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as Transnistria, with a long-standing history of conflict, no doubt.
Ambassador Beck.
Okay. I would pick up also on something which Alex has raised, and this is the reasons why Putin went in. And I do believe that he's very much wants to keep Ukraine within the sphere of influence or domination of Russia. Ukraine is indeed the birthplace of the Russian state. The original Ukraine was Kievan Rus because the people who settled there were the Rus, and they went to the east to establish Russia. But I also wanted to say that one of the things that has shaken everybody in terms of that wake-up call is that we talk about the war being in Ukraine, but it's really Mr. Putin's war, and we should remember that. It's not a war of the Russian people, but it's Europe's war because European stability, peace, and prosperity and the democratic values are under attack. It's our war for exactly the same reasons. It's our war because the international order, which Dean Barabom mentioned at the beginning, is being shaken at the roots. It's a war of a brutal despot against democracy, freedom, self-determination, human rights. And to the present time, Ukraine is doing the fighting to defend that for all of us. It is making an incredible sacrifice. And the question I come up when you were talking about all of the economic disruptions that are going to happen, that's going to hurt. But does it hurt as much as the blood and the loss of treasure or the loss of life being driven out of the country that the Ukrainians are put up? And I would hope that when we have to cope with this, people will think twice about complaining and saying, oh, I'm sacrificing so much when they have sacrificed everything.
Thank you for that particular comment. And I would just note that very few of us would have heard of Prime Minister, or President, Zelensky until just a few weeks ago, right? But this war, and ironically, right, has elevated him to superhero status, a status he would probably personally rather live without, but certainly this attack has shown him to be a man of incredible courage and truly a beacon for democracy and human rights in a way that nothing but this war could have done. So thanks, Vlad, or Putin, for that, right?
Martin, if I can
Go
make
ahead.
a couple of quick points, just piggybacking onto that, Zelensky, some of you are old enough to remember the commercials, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on television. Well, he was not a politician, but he used to play one on television before getting elected. And he understands the power of media, especially social media. So he is now the ultimate influencer out there. And that is very important in terms of shaping world public opinion and allowing, as the ambassador said, those of us who are going to suffer from this to take some of that suffering in order to understand what's going over there. A couple quick points. The misjudgment of Putin is both surprising and not so surprising, especially on the economic side, because autocrats surround themselves with yes people. So they don't hear the flip side of the coin, what they're risking. Today, a small NATO country, most Eastern NATO country, Turkey, was one of the first countries to send actual weapons to the Ukraine. Drones with ability to shoot. Now, Turkey is both dependent on Russia economically, also militarily because of the Syria conflict. Turkey is dependent on Russia because one of the big pipelines is coming from Russia. Sorry, that's my wife's medication reminder. My apologies. Is it 8 o'clock? Yes, it is. So when Turkey sent those weapons, you're going to say, what are drones? Those drones are destroying tanks without any loss of life on the Ukrainian side. The other thing I wanted to mention is refugee crisis that you mentioned. Europe's response to this refugee crisis is indeed very different than its response to the Syrian refugee crisis. Germany actually paid Turkey substantial amount of money to house 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey to prevent them from coming to Europe, let alone giving them right to live and work. So you have to take a little bit of history to understand that there's also a little bit of an ethnic racial issue here about the welcome for refugees that look like us as far as the European arc is concerned. Finally, EU and NATO, obviously, I absolutely agree with you, are not in a position to accept Ukraine as a member. But if Putin keeps pushing, as he's difficult to say, if Putin keeps pushing, they're going to find a category of affiliation without making them members that is going to give them the de facto benefit of being members. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess I wouldn't be a liberal arts dean worth my salt if I didn't also point out that Zelensky is one hell of a dancer. You've probably seen, right, that he won Ukraine's version of Dancing with the Stars. More World Cup 15 years ago. So he's a really talented guy, as we've seen. I guess one other thing, at the risk of sort of going into whataboutism, but I did want to mention this. We probably should always be thinking about this and looking at this and thinking about the environment. Ukraine, of course, is a major food producer for the world and potential disruption to supply of food around the world. We've already heard about how Egypt, for example, is dependent on foodstuffs coming from this part of the world. So lots of potential disruption coming in terms of food. Critical component, of course, essential for sustaining life. But then, of course, with the oil and gas discussion, a little note to self, oh, darn, I wish I had bought the electric car a few years ago, right? Or at least a hybrid. Our continued dependence on oil and gas and its impact on the planet, of course, we're now paying a price for that, literally and figuratively both. So it's always relevant, I think, to bring up, even if it doesn't seem like an immediate factor in the crisis and its resolution. We're trying to get the slides to move here, but I'll start with, but we'll, if you want to sort of start pulling some questions from the chat, we'll give you all a chance to ask any questions you might have for any of the panelists or just in general. Anyone want to start us off? Yes.
I'm just wondering what the panel's thoughts are about how change will come to Russia. It seems like to me it comes kind of suddenly and cataclysmically. 1917, I can remember when Khrushchev became a non-person. Is there still anything like a Politburo that can pull Putin out of there and bring this country into something like a normal country? Are people like Khodorkovsky or Navalny influential enough to rise out of the horror of this war and take Russia in a new direction? How do you see that happening?
I'm just going to summarize the question real briefly so that people on the Zoom can hear it. Just the question is, how can change come to Russia? Who can influence Putin potentially to change the course of actions that's currently underway?
The question is, where is there going to be an off-ramp? And I don't see Putin giving up. I mean, Putin's going out full force to destroy Ukraine. And people like Navalny, if Putin goes down, I think Navalny will end up dead. I mean, he's in prison, I forget how long of a sentence. So I don't see anything happening like that. The only way something's going to potentially happen is if for some reason the generals, as well as the KGB, go against him. Otherwise, no. I mean, the people are arresting people in St. Petersburg and Moscow. So the people don't matter to Putin. He has, as someone said earlier, a bunch of yes men around him. And so he is insulated, and he doesn't care what his people think. He doesn't care what the international community thinks. As was mentioned, he sort of was shocked as a result of the invasion. He didn't expect this to happen. And we see that the Russian forces, some of them are surrendering. They were told they were just going in for maneuvers. I believe today another Russian general was killed. So it's, but he doesn't care. He's going to go full hog.
It's very difficult. There is nobody around him except the yes men.
Right.
They are dependent on him. You'll notice in the television coverage from Moscow, he sits about as far away from them as the questioner was, probably 35 to 40 feet, a little bit outside of, if I may say, pistol range.
Yeah, exactly.
He's very, very careful. On the other hand, it's hard for us to foresee what might happen, but it is probably, in my opinion, the only way that Mr. Putin is going to go is that he is going to be removed by somebody with extreme prejudice, as we say.
Mhm.
A military coup, essentially.
Yeah.
Or assassination.
Or an assassination.
The one thing that was mentioned here is that the people who have the power and or the resources to be able to take him out are dependent on it. They are part of that cadre of yes people. Their fortunes depend on him. Their future depends on him. So they're not going to be the ones taking action. But of course, I'm from the business school, so I'm going to think about economy. The pressure on the people of Russia economically is going to create enough resentment and enough. Why do you think he's oppressing the press even more than ever before? Why do you think he's trying to put the dissent down internally? Because he knows that's his only Achilles heel in the medium to long term. There will come a time when the Russian people say, enough with this 1 cent. I want food on my table. I want to be able to send my kid to school. But I agree with the comment that it might take that extreme prejudice, because openly nobody's going to, at this point yet, oppose it internally.
In the back? Yeah.
Has the focus of the world gravitated solely on this conflict in Ukraine? Where do you think this will impact other priorities like the UN and other, major influential nation states step forward, considering that this will supposedly hinder our progress with climate change and preventing catastrophic climate change consequences? Where do you think this will hurt the Paris climate goals and all that as the work continues on and dominates needs?
Can you paraphrase? I could not hear all of it.
Question, I couldn't totally hear it either, but are you asking essentially how will the handling of this crisis affect the urgency of sticking to the agreements that, such as they are, that we've reached in terms of addressing climate change? Okay.
I do have a, one of the,
In addition to that, as this is for a new energy crisis, what measures do you think the U.S. government can take to enhance proliferation of electric cars and sustainable public transport, as we now realize that gas is a commodity like our economy?
Right. So to the degree that this precipitates an energy crisis, might it, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but actually produce an opportunity in terms of making the move toward renewable energy sources.
interesting, in Europe, the French are doubling down, if you will, on nuclear. So they're moving away from fossil fuel and into nuclear. The Germans have already said, we're going to stop taking any Russian oil by, I think it's been 10 years or whatever. They're over 50% dependent on Russian oil and gas right now. But they've already said, okay, we're going to go away from that because even the previous government was moving away from coal. The Greens and the SPD are moving even faster towards renewable. Chancellor Scholz said, absolutely, we're just going to increase renewables, wind and solar. But you have just a point of diminishing returns. You simply cannot replace it fast enough. But their first step is to try to get off of coal and gas, and then and to go to that step. So in Europe, they're moving in that direction, and they're already far ahead of us in the production of electric cars. I was last in Europe, in Germany, back in the winter or late fall, to the Tesla plant, where they're going to be turning out electric cars like mad. I mean, the environmentalists are actually opposed to the Tesla plant because he's taking up all the groundwater and destroying as a result. And the problem of also of going more to electric cars is that we have to get the materials, the rare metals, to make the batteries, and those are in large measure come from Russia and from China, if I understand that correctly.
And part of your question had to do with the economics of this thing, but let me put things economically into context a little bit. Some of the most pessimistic understandings of this conflict tell us that the impact on our GDP is going to be a slowing of the growth of our GDP between 0.5% to 1%. That is phenomenal, but look how resilient we are as an economy. Our GDP went into the negative territory just 2 years ago with the pandemic. Arguably, economically speaking, the pandemic was a much bigger economic disruptor than this ever can be unless it goes global. And you're dealing with a person who's not acting rationally anymore and who's embarrassed, with very, very high ego person who's not embarrassed, so that he's going to likely to do things that we're not going to like one bit. But even then, economically speaking, its ripple effects, as bad as they are going to be, will not even come close to the economic disruption that the pandemic caused. And we reacted globally as well as in the United States very resiliently. And while we collectively suffered, it's horrible wearing those masks all the time, horrible doing everything on Zoom all the time. A lot of our friends and family members lost their jobs. A lot of friends and families got sick, and some of them died. But we went through it because human nature as well as economies are incredibly resilient. Look at what happened historically in the Second World War. Some of the greatest advances in world economy happened in the post-war period because everything was broken, he had to rebuild it. So I fear that the impetus to do that social change you're talking about is not going to come from governments, and it's definitely not going to come from the private sector because their future is dependent on what they have already invested in. They're not going to voluntarily switch to electric cars suddenly. Governments are not going to suddenly put extra taxes on gasoline so that you switch to electric cars or solar or renewables. It's going to happen by us doing incremental changes as consumers. Problem is, in an economic problem era, your ability to finance such good deeds is not there. In the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, some of you will know that, we're going down the pyramid rather than up the pyramid when there's economic disruption. So we might want to do those good things, but in the final analysis, you'll rationalize and say, I'm not going to change the world on my own. I need to put food on my table.
Next question.
Hey, how y'all doing? So, a lot of the emphasis is on, European Union, especially when you're talking about on the home front during times of war. But especially from a media standpoint and from a political standpoint, we negate the experiences of racism and discrimination. And what we have found, especially on media, especially on social media, is the treatment of Black people, not only from the continent of Africa that are going to Ukraine, but also Black Ukrainians that are there. And of course, there's racism and discrimination going on. And we don't really talk about those things, especially when we talk about how, again, war is supposed to somewhat unite us, but then again, the system that is set in place to discriminate is still present. So I guess from a media standpoint, this is a two-parter. Like, why is it that a lot of our media stations are not talking about those elements given the world that we are in, especially when you talk about discrimination based on race. But then from a political standpoint, why is the UN, specifically, granted all the flaws of the UN, why aren't countries acknowledging that given the experiences of Black people that's shown through the media aspect?
So it's a very complex issue, right? And so I think, traditionally in media structures, the idea is always to point to, like I said earlier when I talked about the young girl listening, Let It Go. It's very easy to point to a cute young white girl and say, look at this, isn't this sad? Whereas because of structural racism, we don't necessarily get the same feeling when we're shown, a Black person that's doing almost the exact same thing. And so I think it's really difficult for our the media that's always been kind of structurally built to highlight the white folks as opposed to Black folks that don't necessarily drive the sympathy and don't drive ratings and things like that in the same way, even though they very clearly should. And I think, Alexandra mentioned too, if we look at Poland's response to Ukrainians coming across the border, very open arms. Whereas just a few months ago when Arabs were coming across the border, it was, no, you're not allowed in. And so we like that positive story, whereas the racism that exists inherently in our system prevents us from highlighting the things that aren't as attractive, quote unquote, which is unfortunate. And politically speaking, it doesn't poll as well either.
I'll make a comment as well. At the beginning of our Democracy Across the Disciplines series last fall, I gave that kickoff lecture on democracy across the disciplines and sort of thought about sort of the progress of democracy in our own country over the centuries, where, of course, initially the Constitution was written by men who owned slaves, and yet those ideas had the power, right, ultimately to liberate and transform our society. If you think about today, and even in the last couple of years, the people who have really sort of put it out there for democracy have been women. And my last slide, I had Liz Cheney, right, and Stacey Abrams. You talk about voting rights or sort of facing down your fellow party members in our own struggle to sustain and expand democracy in our own country. And their accomplishments and the importance of the work they're doing takes nothing away from Zelensky in Ukraine right now, which sort of inarguably sort of holds center stage right now in terms of that struggle. But it is a universal struggle, and it is important, and we all have a stake in ensuring that it does ultimately liberate all peoples. And so race is a really important theme in this discussion as well. Joe.
It's a comment and a question to kind of tie that in. I mean, yeah, I think to go off that, I mean, and you can see it in the news coverage. I mean, you literally have broadcasters saying, these are people who look like us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's amazing amounts of that. So you just have to watch the footage to sort of see it. But yeah, it doesn't overlook the realities of what's happening at like a genocide in Ethiopia that is arguably killing far more people.
Yemen.
Still.
Yemen.
Yemen, yeah, Yemen. With speaking of helping people with arms, right?
Still Syria.
Right,
Still.
absolutely. So,
And
what,
2 weeks ago, the US bombed Somalia.
right. So with that said, I wonder, and again, this is sort of a question, I don't want to focus it only on the economics folks, but I think that's kind of where it sort of go. Do you think that as time goes on with the refugee crisis getting worse, with the continued flooding of people from Ukraine to other parts of Europe, do you think that with the economic stresses that brings, with issues of social spending and resource allocation, do you see this as a moment legitimately where like perceptions of refugees will actually be transformed just because they happen to share the same color? Or do you think that there is going to just be a tipping point where, like all other conflicts, self-interest and national sort of identity in the end trumps, more idealistic views? Although that being said, Romania let in a very large amount of Nigerian Ukrainians.
And I have an explanation, sort of.
Yeah.
So if I can talk about the ethnocentrism in Europe, we would still be here at 2 a.m. So clearly Europe, and I will always say this, Europe is very ethnically divided, and it has traditionally been so, racially divided more recently in history. Romania has had a particularly interesting or unique sort of rapport with a lot of countries during the Cold War in Africa as well as in the Middle East, and that's part of the reason why we were allowed to was because we were a satellite country. So Russia got to have a little bit of a say as far as certain, like trade agreements and such. But for the most part, we were allowed to manage ourselves, and we've always had great sort of educational exchanges with a lot of countries in Africa. A lot of countries in the Middle East. And I was actually sharing this in a discussion with my husband and a friend last night. My cousins who went to we had really good polytechnic institutes in Romania and medical schools. So actually a quarter of their colleagues were from the different African countries. So for us, we've always meaning starting with the 60s and the 70s, we've welcomed, just different, not just different ethnic groups. That's a separate discussion. But we've actually had different racial groups present and welcomed in Romania. So I do think that's more of a unique situation. But going back to what Sebastian was saying, Sebastian, I'm sorry, did I get your name wrong?
Oh, no, my name's Dorian.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I heard Sebastian. But you've definitely made a great point, and I think the reality that we all have to put quite plainly on the table is that similar structures that exist in the U.S. also exist in Europe, and we have to not just acknowledge them but actively fight them, which part of the reason why I mentioned that. While I'm very happy that there's been such a cohesive response from the frontline countries in Europe to the Ukraine refugee crisis, there was a hardly comparable response in 2015 when Syrian refugees came, and it's a shame, and it's tragic because the status of refugees should be the same irrespective of where they come from, and that's probably one of the lessons we'll have to learn. We have to be there for everyone who faces terror and war and hunger and death. It doesn't matter if they're from, the neighboring country or from 2 continents away. So
Your question had a very interesting economic piece to it. You said, will that refugee crisis be the tipping point to change perceptions and responses to refugee issues? The answer is no. The answer is very emphatically no, because even with all the disruptions that those refugees are going to be in, even with all the displacements of workers, because you're allowing these people now to work up to 3 years, even with all of that, the total economic footprint of that is minute compared to the rest of the refugee crises out there. If Germany can afford to pay a country like Turkey to house and employ and feed and educate and treat 4 million refugees in a country of 80 million people, that's a huge percentage, by the way, with no change in any perception, no change in any different way of looking. Look, we know that the change to these mindsets will have to happen through significant disruption. And that disruption at this point is not going to happen because economically it's not going to be that damaging. It's easily to absorb. When you lob one missile, you're spending enough money to feed a refugee for 3-4 years. Okay? People don't realize the scale of these expenditures, economically speaking. So the ability of the European as well as our economies to absorb refugees is very much there. It's not that difficult. Going back to your question, most of the time we refuse to do it because they don't look like us. We don't want them mixing with our systems. BBC did an excellent report. I believe it was last week. It's still on their website. If you can go look at it, they were, it was a radio report. They were putting on clips of reporters from around the world making comments that were offensive, racially speaking. But they had no idea. They were just simply reporting the news. And final thing I'll say on this, my wife is from France. We have property there. Part of my family is there. In France, I see racism much more out in the open, both systemically as well as in the community. It is not frowned upon. It's not underground. It is very much in the open. That is not going to change just because of this refugee crisis.
Britain also, in Britain also.
It's, this is, of course, one of the most complicated issues that you can deal with. And I'll just make some observations based on my personal observations because I'm not an expert in any way in this respect. And these mostly have to do with Germany, where I've spent most of my studies and most of my work. You can find cases of gross discrimination, and you can find cases of incredible absorption and coming together. When I worked in Berlin in the 1970s, there was a real problem what to do with the Turkish Gastarbeiter. Not just the Gastarbeiter, but their children and their grandchildren who were born in Germany and who no longer spoke decent Turkish because they spoke Berlinerisch dialect or Schwäbisch dialect, and they spoke German better. And when they went back to Turkey, they felt disconnected, but they were not accepted originally in Germany. Over time, it's interesting to see that many of these people, many of the Turks, have been absorbed to the point that the head of the Green Party in Germany was a Turkish German.
Yep.
And he's a minister in the cabinet right now. And you see successes like that, and you see terrible cases. You were referring to some, I think, that were seen where people were trying to get on the trains to go to Poland and they were being pushed away. Those happen too. And coming to terms with that is very difficult. And it is something which I can tell you, in East Germany, for example, in the GDR, they had large populations of Vietnamese who came as guest workers. They had large numbers of Africans who came. I got to know a professor at Carleton College, my alma mater, who is a Black East German. She said she never experienced any racial discrimination in the GDR, only after unification. So these things have very complex issues. They need to be addressed. There's no question about that. But it's interesting that on one level, there's that accommodation, and on the other, there's not. Mrs. Merkel worked out the deal with Turkey to keep the 4 million there. Germany still took on 1 million refugees. Interestingly enough, that was the driving force for the right-wing nationalist neo-fascists, all these foreigners. They've dropped that campaign because these people, these refugees from all over the Middle East and Afghanistan are being absorbed and taken into the situation. So they're both successful and failing at the same time.
Correct. And I completely agree with that. And the other piece is we as a society tend to be influenced by many different things. But what is our number one export to the world? The thing that brings the United States the most money. And anybody know what our number one export is? No, it's culture, it's entertainment. Thank you, Chris. It's entertainment. And when you go to France, see, we are addicted to Netflix and Megahertz and Acorn and BritBox, these streaming services from Europe. Obviously, we're from there. So when we watch shows produced in France, the bad guys are almost always Arabic. When we watch shows produced in the Scandinavian countries, the bad guys are almost always Arabic. When we watch shows from Germany, of crime in Germany, bad guys are frequently Turkish descent. When they're speaking amongst each other, I understand the language. So that does have, I don't think that's the explicit desire of the producers and the directors and the screenwriters, but it has an impact on communities. This is your area. You know, this concept of being influenced, they're not saying all Turks are bad. They're not saying all Arabs are bad, but after a while you're realizing that the bad guys, you don't think that's happening here? They're Black, they're Hispanic, they're not, they don't look like the good guys on TV. So, as you said, Ambassador, it's so complex and it's so interrelated to the fabric of our lives that in the long history of humanity, this is just a blip. It's not going to change much.
Well, and lest we forget, 80 years ago, Europe was embroiled in a conflict that was very much constructed as a race war, right? With the Nazis constructing this hierarchy of racial groups, all made up, by the way, constructed, but nonetheless deadly, and not least in Ukraine itself, which of course was home to millions of Jews. And so I was actually in Ukraine with a group of students a few years ago, extreme Western Ukraine, sub-Carpathian Ruthenia, back in the day. Uzhgorod, yeah, which was the part of Czechoslovakia between the wars, Hungary during the war, and then joined Ukraine after. You know, stuffed into
It was a gift.
Ukraine at the end of the war. And so we visited sites of remembrance there, you know, devastated synagogues and graveyards, which are basically the sole remnant of what was once a vibrant, many vibrant Jewish communities in Ukraine and that part of Europe that wiped out essentially by the war. And of course, so interesting that Zelensky is Jewish, president of Ukraine today. So, but of course the number is much diminished. Questions from the Zoom? Go ahead. Yeah, we have a few more minutes. If you need to leave, yeah, we'll give it maybe 10 more minutes. But
so our colleagues on Zoom would like to know your thoughts on the most probable outcome. And there was especially an expression of anxiety about the security of the nuclear power plant.
If I knew the answer to that,
Yeah, who knows?
I'd be very rich by next year.
It's anybody's guess.
So unpredictable.
Yeah, totally unpredictable.
Yeah,
That's the
it's-
source code of volatility in economics. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I'm saying that uncertainty is the source code of the whole concept of volatility and economic disruption. You know, if we knew exactly or even had a guess at how this is going to happen, we could deal with it. But you, as I said earlier, you're dealing with a very high ego individual who just got slapped down in a way he never expected, and he's not going to back down. This is a guy who likes going on horses bare-chested and just showing what a macho guy he is, and suddenly his column cannot even enter key. So no, I don't know.
I think
let's not forget that the Soviet Union, before our Afghan war, there was the Soviet war in Afghanistan. So protracted and futile military conflicts. They're not the only ones, I should, I guess, point out. But it's happened before that they've been drawn into long, protracted conflicts, which ultimately proved to be their undoing. We seem to be able to afford these things a little bit better than they do. But the Afghan war obviously undermined the Soviet Union dramatically.
But also, too, this is a nationalistic war, and you can't defeat nationalism. Look at Vietnam. Afghanistan was another example.
Yep.
So,
Yep. Resist.
it will be a long time. Putin does not have a sufficient number of troops to hold down all of Ukraine. If he only occupies part of Ukraine, he will discover, as was the case in the 1950s, that irredentist and insurrection will go on well after the, quote, fighting stops. But it'll be a period of tension, of constant tension, and absolute misery for the people of Ukraine.
And specifically as it relates to the nuclear threat, My immediate concern is a miscalculation. I think we've seen so many from the Russian side, and my fear is that part of this, need for control of these sites, there's something that might go wrong at some point, again, because their strategy is loose or ambiguous at best. So my fear is for a very, catastrophic event to happen as a result of one of these. I don't think they would intentionally do something that would be clearly affecting them as well. But my fear is, as I said, connected to how bad planners they've been about this whole thing. And with the amount of nuclear capacity there is in Ukraine currently, there's a high chance for mistakes to happen.
And I'd like to remind the audience as well as that Zoom participants that when we talk about nuclear weapons, they're not just the ballistic missiles, there's the tactical news. So one of the things somebody like Putin might do is use one of those, just the way we did in Hiroshima with the bigger one in Nagasaki. He might think, I don't know this, but he might think, if I lob a small one into the middle of Kyiv, maybe this will change the course of the discussion. That would be a miscalculation, because the response from the rest of the world is going to be significantly more than what it is now. But it also increases the likelihood of escalation. So right now, Chris, I prefer not answering that question and just hoping for the best.
So I've been here for an hour and a half waiting to ask that question. All of you guys. I'm an optimist. I'm an obnoxious optimist. I came to this campus in 1982. Greg Cashman talked about ICBMs, who had so many. And so I don't want to spoil it for you younger people, but what was left to us is a very, very dangerous world. And I was hoping tonight we would get to this point. And I ask you, don't back away from that question. Please give us a little, understand our pessimism and say that Putin is playing, tri-level chess or something. And he wants us to worry like this, that he might throw a tactical.
Sure. Well, and maybe just to go back to the conventional war for a moment, we're thinking about, certainly on the home front, right? There are people who are speaking out and demonstrating in the streets at the risk of 15-year prison sentences. How many millions more who maybe don't speak out, but nonetheless don't support it? Maybe they can't do anything. But what about the soldiers in Ukraine, to whom the Ukrainians are addressing their comments, if not to go F themselves, to try to keep it family friendly here, go home to your families, right? And you really wonder about the morale of the Russian soldiers fighting Ukraine and their will to prosecute this war.
Well, if you take a look at 1968 Czechoslovakia, the same exact thing.
Yeah.
Where the Soviets came in and they were told they were going to be welcome as liberators. And the Czechs and Slovaks told them, we don't want you here. It's time for you to leave. They never left. They didn't leave until the wall fell. So I see the same thing happening here.
And unlike the most of the Western world, Russian soldiers are conscripts.
Right.
They don't choose to be soldiers. They don't choose to be there. And they don't want to be there.
Which is why the desertion rates in previous conflicts has been significant compared to other armies. And this ties into, I think, what Dr. Farron said earlier, that there's never really been a significant concern for the human factor, that Putin doesn't have that. He doesn't care about his people. Well, Putin has seen it in previous Soviet leaders. Lenin did not care about his people. Stalin did not care about his people. So I feel like, unfortunately and sadly and tragically, that oftentimes Russian military is thrown in these conflicts without the information that they need to be able to do even marginal work. And that's why everything's just so scattered, so disorganized, and so chaotic.
And to further address your question, all countries, all Western countries, and all large countries with large militaries have their war colleges. And in the war colleges, one of the things they do, they do simulations, war games. And in this conflict, many simulations are being done, not only by these war colleges, but also by think tanks. I'm a simulation modeling expert, so I follow these things. And here's what's happening. When you do a simulation, It's like a shotgun blast, right? You don't count the little ones at the surrounding area. You only count the middle of the blast. But those ones in the surrounding area are more important now because you're not dealing with rational decision-making process. He doesn't have the information he needs to have. The military doesn't have the information it needs to have. They're all these things. So suddenly the most unlikely solutions that we ignore are back in the realm of possibility. I am an optimist when it comes to global thermonuclear war, per se, because everybody knows that that's a no-win situation. Okay? Remember, some of you will remember the movie War Games. You know, the computer finally realizes that this is a no-win, tic-tac-toe, stops doing what it's doing. But as I said, tactical nukes are a whole different ballgame. Dirty bombs are a whole different ballgame. That is my fear, my pessimism about that, not the big stuff.
What do we think? We have time for a couple. We'll go to 8:45 and then we will definitely need to wrap it up. I want to see if there's anybody any questions from the Zoom, burning questions from the Zoom. Do you need a minute? We can take it.
Good.
Ursula, go ahead.
I have a somewhat different question. Is there a way that any of you can see? Is there a way, a face-saving way for Putin to get out of this?
No.
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 As I said earlier, there is no off-ramp.
No,
That's the key.
at least not yet.
Not yet, that's true, but at this point, no.
We have to play the game for a while.
This, picking up from that and coming back to your question, we all learned about MAD, mutually assured destruction. It's still on the table. And like you, I believe that even the irrational man in the Kremlin recognizes that if he throws an intercontinental ballistic missile, a MIRV rocket will come back. Mm-hmm. And that's not going to help him. He's not going to be able to spend his billions. Thank you. He can't ride on his horse. He knows that. But that raises, however, another very difficult question. If the concerns which we in NATO and the United States and everybody else about the no-fly zone is that will lead us into a greater war, is our fear because of a nuclear war? I'm for one, don't think that's I'm not the decision maker, so it's easy for me to say, I don't think that's a real possibility. But then it raises the question, are we in this supporting and cheering on, but not willing to get involved in a bigger fight on a conventional level, where we might actually suffer, where we will lose soldiers, where we will lose financially or economically? I don't think we would be, in line to get hit with a nuke. I don't believe that. But I'm not the decision maker, and I defer to the fact that Blinken and Biden and Boris Johnson have to make that decision. I think that is still on the table. I think it is still possible to go to Russia and say, Putin, you got 24 hours, and then we institute a no-fly zone. Get your troops out of there. You signed on to the Budapest Memorandum with us and with the UK. And now let's face him down and see whether or not he's going to blink. That's the extreme position that I would go to. Whether I would do it if I were the president, I don't know. But as an observer, I'm perfectly willing to put it on the table.
And 10 years ago, I would have said that's not going to happen. Today, I'm not so sure that that is completely off the table. One of the reasons is we're coming to two very difficult election cycles. And if you look at elections, when people are in trouble domestically, what do? They lob a missile.
Well, and I will say from a governmental communication standpoint, the president and Blinken and a lot of the other communication officials within the administration seem to be talking that sanctions and aid to the Ukrainians that are fighting right now is more than enough. And so they're going to continue that. there's members of Congress that are saying maybe we're giving too much to Ukrainians because we're not really aware of where it's going once it gets there. And so maybe we're kind of getting into an 80s Afghanistan situation where we've helped them and they fight the Russians and win, but then what happens after the Russians leave to all of that, ammunition and the weaponry that we've given them. So from the communication standpoint, they're talking like sanctions and aiding the Ukrainians at this point is as far as they're willing to go. They're not stepping into the next level of escalation.
Or take it back another 50 years to the 30s, where you have people volunteering, as in the Spanish Civil War, to go fight the Phalange. Although in this case, certainly with bigger support from the government, just fearful of intervening, being seen to intervene militarily.
But I'm interested in what you and Greg would think on the parallel that obviously comes up, both being historians and particularly in Germany, that we're no longer at Chamberlain and Munich because we've already reached the 1st of September 1939.
Yes.
And there's no longer saying we've got peace in our time.
Correct.
And yet, when do you finally say this is enough? This shall not stand.
Took more than 2 years after September 1st, 1939 for the U.S.
Well, we've had our Pearl Harbor experience. Thank you. Only not on our soil.
Not on our, and Pearl Harbor does depend on the attack, on the direct attack.
Right.
Wow. Yes, we could go on and on about that. How about one more question from the back, or you've had your hand up for a while. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask if you think the expansion of NATO would be escalating of tensions at this point. Because obviously, Sweden and Finland have avoided that to keep neutrality between the West and Russia, but they've both publicly stated that they've switched their stance on that and they're returning to debates on it. Kosovo recently offered the U.S. to build a military base in their country to quicken their possible membership into NATO. Biden spoke with Zelensky about future NATO or expedited NATO membership. Georgia submitted an application to join the EU. Do you see it as a raising of tensions at this point, or do you see it as a very unified confrontation, be it symbolic or militaristic confrontation or approach to Russia as himself? Because he obviously threatened militaristic action against Finland or Sweden if they join NATO, but that could easily be an empty threat because he knows that is war with NATO, which is the last thing he wants.
I have come to the firm conclusion that the expansion of NATO question is pardon the pun, a red herring. That really what Putin is upset about is that Ukraine has turned its back on him and his system and Mother Russia, Machlutskia, and it's going to the West and becoming a democracy with freedom and human rights and potentially becoming a very, very dangerous example to the Russian people that, hey, we could be like that too. And so I think that, no, I don't think that if they were to join NATO, he would scream it's a provocation, but that's a red herring.
I have a feeling NATO wouldn't do its expansion that way anyway. I think the so-called face-saving way of doing that is giving them the benefits of membership without calling membership. That way you're not creating, because for a lot of things, for Putin, it's how it sounds to his people, how it looks to his people, that image, that macho image. As long as that is not headline threatened, he's not gonna, look, he's in trouble. Economically, he's in trouble. Militarily, he's in trouble, but he's not gonna back down. So he's gonna have to pick and choose which battles he's gonna fight in this war. And as the ambassador said, his big, be under his bonnet is Ukraine, not all of this other stuff.
One last question in the back. Go ahead.
I was just wondering about cyber.
Oh.
We got another two and
We forgot to talk about cyber.
we got another 2.5 hours.
Great. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, just to give you an idea, before the attack on Georgia, there were a lot of cyber activity against Georgia. So, this is not anything new. And as we're seeing, people are saying, should cyber warfare be considered normal warfare or a declaration of war?
Well, Microsoft is a combatant.
Well, and if you look at social media and how Russia played a role in the 2020 election, influencing folks by creating basically fake accounts that are sending out messages that are influencing folks. And so it might not be cyber warfare in terms of like hacking or things like that, but cyber warfare in terms of influencing hearts and minds by showing people like, you know, this is the cost of war. And so all of a sudden people go, I don't necessarily want to see that. I don't like that. And there's a test that is kind of out there. It's called the Dover test. And it's Americans' tolerance for dead soldiers coming home to Dover Air Force Base. And if a Russian actor is out there putting out images of here's all these dead American soldiers, if we ever get to the point where American soldiers are on the ground, that can sway American opinion real fast against it, going, why are all these American soldiers dying fighting a war that isn't ours? And so that might be one way in which cyber warfare is engaged as well, given the fact that we have this social media platform that all it takes is a VPN that takes your location out of Russia and puts it in another country, and nobody knows.
See, I agree with what you said, but I also have a slightly different perspective on this. I actually served during the first Gulf War, and I was part of the coalition forces, and very large component of what we did was psychological warfare. The media of using or deploying psychological warfare has changed. Cyber warfare allows it to happen much faster, a little bit more obfuscation of where it's coming from, maybe a little bit higher impact, but the reality is still psychological warfare. So this has always been part of what we were trained at as combatants, that it's not just the guns and the ammunition that fights the war, it's what the people back home are going to make of it. Look, one of the greatest cyber warfare heroes of all time, in my opinion, never knew anything about computers. It was Tokyo Rose. Okay.
But to the degree that we feared that the Russians would be able to totally mess us up, that has not happened so far.
No.
And I suppose that may be due to our tax dollars being hard at work at the NSA, putting up protection that we've learned to put in place from the cyber attacks that can happen on any given day, on any beautiful day.
And Martin, we also are busy fighting each other in the cyber warfare.
Right, exactly. The Ukrainians can give as good as they might take.
I have an additional thought. I think the discussion on cyber warfare is going to get a little more nuanced if there are a few successful attempts, because then as far as we know that Article 5 will come into discussion if like a NATO country gets attacked. But let's say a cyber attack completely shuts down like the NATO military base in Constanța in Romania, or a hospital where they treat refugees. Could that be viewed as an attack on a member country? Would that trigger Article 5? I think down the line, we will end up having these discussions. We're not there yet because we're dealing with like more marginal, more isolated attacks. But if we're talking sustained, repeated, significantly damaging attacks, I think that discussion will happen down the line.
Why is Cyber Command of NATO in Estonia? Anybody know?
Sorry.
Oh, because Estonia is such an incredibly good cyber country.
And the reason is because when the Russians were leaving, they destroyed everything.
Yeah.
So they learned how to rebuild and fix, so that in Europe, within NATO, that country became the go-to place to deal with these things. Right now, we are currently, all NATO countries are very hard at work hardening our infrastructure against cyber attack, but we're not ready yet. And if there is such a cyber attack like the one you mentioned, it is not in our best interest to publicize it or react to it. We just want to fix it and learn from it yet. Later, it might be different.
I'm just going to build on what people were saying, and that is, I don't know if anyone watched RT TV network, which was the Russian.
Only
back
staying at a hotel and there's nothing
Well,
else.
no, I gotta get it here, or I did until it was taken off, and it was vastly different if you watch, because I was switching between that and CNN, BBC, and Fox, and all that, and then I turned that on. It was totally
Yeah.
different, and of course, it was backed by the Russian government. And so you were getting how the Ukrainians were bombing kindergartens and shelling Russian cities and so forth. And it's rather interesting. So, but that's just an example of what you were talking about.
Yeah, I have, and I'll be happy to share it with you because we may not have time to read the whole thing out. The Russian description of what's going on in the Donbass and how the Americans dragged Europe into this dirty game. And we have been, why have you forgotten American aggression, intervention in war? It's, now it's decided to destabilize Russia through Ukraine and Europe. This is what is coming out. And it goes, on and on and on to paint a picture which is so diametrically opposite from ours. But it's not cyber in that sense of immobilizing. It's cyber in changing your thinking.
Psychological warfare. Yeah.
All right, well, we need to wrap this up. I know we didn't say anything about China even, but I think they're going to play a much smarter game. You can ask about
I was
China.
about to ask. Do you mind a quick question?
All right.
Just a quick question.
Last question on
Yeah,
China.
concerning China, which I wanted to ask. I was going to ask, basically, one of the concerns with the current conflict in Ukraine is that whatever Western reaction would set the precedent for potential Chinese aggression in Taiwan. And this is a question where I really wish that Dr. Nam was here because he's the expert in East Asia politics, but I'll have to make do, I guess. So my question is, do you think the conflict in Ukraine would set such a dangerous precedent for China to allow itself to invade Taiwan, in essence?
Short answer is if we don't really respond dramatically and effectively, yes. If we roll over in our paper tiger, yes.
Also, too, I think Memo would know better is the economic aspects. I mean, China, I think the sanctions would really, really affect China much more so than Russia.
Absolutely. And
Don't
look
forget,
what's
it'd be an incredibly
happening.
stupid thing to do.
Exactly. And look what's happening. I think this is a good thing for the Taiwanese. You know why? Because China did not also expect the reaction of the West the way this happened. So they initially were in support of Russia because they wanted to be able to do the same thing with Taiwan. And when this happened, lo and behold, they abstained at the United Nations. That was to me a shocker, but it's saying that they will not stop on their ambition of one day doing it, but it's not going to be this way because the reaction of the rest of the world was phenomenal. And as the Parabim said, economically, we're not that linked to Russia very much, 3%. China, both them and us.
Mm-hmm. If I may add as well, Taiwan is also a far more defensible country. It's an island where the distance between them and the mainland is about twice the length of the English Channel, Britain and Normandy, number one. And number two, Taiwan also has a far more advanced military. And its people perhaps has, I think, just as much a patriotic fervor, if not more, than in Ukraine. So I think if China were to, again, if China does do a similar invasion, it's going to be another all or nothing gamble like Putin is with Ukraine. They're going to become an international pariah. It's probably become more difficult, as you and Dr. Ferenc have sort of jokingly remarked just recently, like a minute ago. The U.S. is a lot more reliant, and the West, by and large, is a lot more reliant on trade with China, which means that the U.S. will have to, in the West, have to find alternatives, whether it be domestic production here in the U.S. or in Europe. India is, I think, a very strong potential candidate, I think. Other countries as well can fill in the boot, fill in the mantle for China.
Just this afternoon in my international marketing class, I mentioned this. I said the economic relationship between China and the West, and especially the United States, is very much akin to the threat of global thermonuclear war, because that MAD, mutually assured destruction, economically exists between us now. If we really harm them, we're going to get harmed back. So there's a limit to what we can do and then a limit what they can do without pissing each other off.
And China is playing a much more successful global game in terms of its
global
economic
and
interests.
long game.
Yes. There. And so bottom line is it would be profoundly stupid to attack Taiwan. So that's it. Didn't stop Putin from doing something similarly stupid with Ukraine, but there we are. All right, well, thank you all for coming. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to our tech support. And thanks to you in Zoom land for your patience. And we'll stay in touch. Go home to your families and change your passwords.
Hey, how are you? Long time no see. I'm busy with things I want to be busy with. No.
No, it's so thrilled to be in. I didn't even realize. It's been 5 years. Where are the Ruthenians?
4,000 students.
Everyone's
Well,
You know, we were given license by the State Department. And now it's obviously a dormitory.
Yeah.
yeah, right.
So I mean,
And only Woodrow Wilson.
Gentlemen, very enjoyable.
I'm gonna ask, I can't stand it.
Ruthenia for the Ruthenian.
Yeah, I love the, 7 PhDs in Colorado.
Well,
I know.
I don't have a crystal ball.
Everything you guys said.
Well, thanks.
And so you're still gonna go to Eastern Europe? So you're gonna still go to Eastern Europe when you graduate?
Not Russia.
Not Russia.
Or Ukraine.
Well, they just canceled McDonald's in Russia today. So now things are serious. The lines of people
I've
just
got an ally over here.
they're queued up for.
Because there's no last
He's
week.
obviously right because he thinks like me.
I was thinking the same thing, by the way.
Everything. I mean, the situation of just being there. Like,
Oh, yeah, no, it's, I teach
I
now.
don't want to be in the vicinity of all this.
Well, you don't want to be too
Depressing,
close to it. Yeah, no, I know. Like when I was actually Chernobyl blew up. I stayed out of Eastern Europe.
In that famous.
So I went, I was the year before and the year after.
Good move. Yeah, good
Yeah,
move.
it's
Yeah.
like, I don't know if I want to do that.
And I was telling Joe too, like